So if you are here for the session, which is about how risk averse are trustees, or are they risk averse, and how might we best manage risk, then you're in the right place. If you are not here for that conversation, you're welcome to stay, but that's a conversation we're going to be having today. So I'm just going to kick off and ask our panelists to introduce themselves briefly. So Alex, would you like to kick off, please?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name's Alex Dow. I'm an investment director at Rathbones. So I specialising in looking after charities. So I spend a lot of time talking to trustees and charity boards, trying to work out what's the right level of risk to take with their investments if they're lucky enough to have those investments. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Alex. Over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Francis. I'm Karen Bradshaw. In the day job, I'm a chief executive. I'm the chief executive of an organisation called Charity Finance Group, which basically does what it says on the tin in the sense of it covers all aspects of charity finance. But I would also say that I'm a serial trustee. I'm a repeat offender when it comes to non-exec roles. I sit on lots of audit and risk committees. And I would describe myself as a risk enthusiast.
And then over to you, Sabrina.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina Siegel. I am also a serial risk enthusiast, so that may mark two of us, Karen. I run a consulting organization called Tolerable Risk. I also have a podcast, as you can see up there. I'll encourage folks to check that out. But I am about a 20-year veteran of the humanitarian and international development sector. And I consult with charities large and small, and I support them mostly in their enterprise risk, program risk, helping to build risk cultures, and of course, working a lot with trustees to help them understand kind of, where their sweet spot role is when it comes to supporting the organizations to take the risks that they need to achieve the objectives that they want to achieve, but also to make sure that they're protecting the organization. I am actually a new trustee, so I've been on the risk side reporting to boards. I am a new trustee also sitting on the risk and audit committee, and so it's going to be very interesting for me to see my role, but from a different perspective. So thank you all for coming today, and thanks, Francis, for having me on the panel.
Well, welcome to trusteeship. It's, I was a governance person for many years before I became a trustee, and I thought it was time to see it from the other side. So it's always a nice and different and unique perspective that you get from that. Okay, so just to introduce myself, my name is Frances Brown. I'm an associate with Getting on Board. My background is, as I said, governance. I've been head of governance at a number of organisations, including the Red Cross and Mind. I also teach on and do work around EDI, in particular race equity. So those are kind of my areas of specialism. So we are going to be covering today whether trustees are truly risk averse, and if so, whether they are right to be so, how charities take informed risks. We want to look at the most common types of risks that affect charities, and whether the relative weighting of risks that we have in organisations and in charities is right or wrong. So I'm going to kick off by asking our panellists to share a kind of real life example of risks that they've encountered as trustees and how the board approached them. Did they take a risk, play it safe? What was the outcome? So who'd like to kick off on that one?
I can jump in if that's helpful.
That's fabulous.
So the example that I think I'll share is when I was the operationally active chair of a preschool. And if I say that my youngest kids are 20 now, so it was quite some time ago. But we encountered a fairly major safeguarding issue as a board, which eventually led to us parting company with the person who was leading that particular preschool. So there were a whole bunch of different risks that we were being asked to face, and it had, as many smaller organisations had, the added complexity of being actually in the community, that it was, you know, serving. So some of the other issues around being a preschool in a community and the engagement with communication with parents and all of those sorts of reputational pieces that sometimes flow from what feels like it's a single risk can very quickly explode out in lots of different directions: risk, money, reputation, money, etc. We had the added complexity of having, as I say, a safeguarding issue that we needed to then deal with from a regulatory perspective too. So one tiny issue suddenly became a very massive thing for the whole board. And I think one thing I would say to begin with is that when we talk about the board as a whole, we sometimes try and collectively say this is what the board does, but actually it's a collection of individuals. So to say, did the board play it safe? I think the position that we got to in the end was very cautious and very carefully managed, but given all the issues that were there. But the natural instincts of different people were very much a broad spectrum of views, with people on one hand being quite bold and brave, and on the other hand being very cautious and reticent. So I think those sorts of range of views that you encounter in these sorts of situations, and the range of consequences that can flow from what feels like a straightforward single lane issue, are the sorts of things that I think we will probably tease out during the course of this conversation.
Thank you. That's great for sharing that. Any other examples that either Alex or Sabrina want to share? Either being a trustee or working with a trustee board.
I mean, I can share from a programmatic point of view. I mean, I think Karen's example is a fantastic one. And I mean, being, having a safeguarding issue with a preschool, that really goes to the core of what your services you're delivering. From a humanitarian and an international development point of view, risks that boards often face when it comes to the types of programming that they want to run or where they want to run that programming. You have your normal, safety and security risks. But again, as Karen mentioned, the reputational risk is huge. And especially when some of the decisions or some of the areas where you want to push the boundaries may run a little bit counter to what your donors want you to do. That's a real place where trustees need to sit down and kind of dig deep and say, is the objective of what we're trying to achieve with this organization something that is going to, kind of shake up the sector a little bit? Are we trying to push the envelope? Are we trying to move maybe more conservative donors into a space where we can have more impact? Or do we want to play it safe? And there's no right answer to that, especially in the funding environment that we're in right now, where we read about, I was reading a statistic, it was 98% of the charities that closed in the UK last year were small to medium-sized charities. We can't fool around with continuing to be a going concern. But at the same time, I do believe that those boards that are willing to say, no, you know what, this is what our organization stands for, and this is where we want to push the boundaries, and trying to find a way to bring those donors along with them is probably some of the most brave and courageous work that I've seen boards do around risk in the work that I've done.
Yeah. What's interesting is obviously both of you have talked about in those environments there being an element of reputational risk. And so I just want to explore a bit, do you think that boards often have the right balance between the managing the reputational risk and managing the other risks, particularly as they pertain to the beneficiaries of the organisation? Is the balance right? Who'd like to volunteer to go first? Alex.
Yeah, I will go first. I'm not sure I can add a huge amount, but I mean, in the area that I'm working in, making sure that the investments don't sort of run contrary to the aims of the charity is one potential reputational risk that we have to watch. In many ways, things can be excluded, but the key thing generally is to make sure that your policy is appropriate, right? There will be times where it's difficult to say fully exclude or say, you know, any investment is fully ethical in everyone's eyes, right? It's a gray area, but it's from our perspective, it would be about understanding what's really important for each charity, which I guess is not necessarily that easy, because you've got a really wide variety of stakeholders which might have different views, and also balancing that against, you know, what is the core objective of the charity, and what are you trying to achieve with the investments themselves, and, you know, are you best placed by trying to generate sufficient returns to help fund your core activities and not be too sidetracked by some of the tricky ethical issues.
Yeah.
So that certainly in investments, reputational risk, you know, can be a factor. It rather depends also on how profile you are as a charity and how much you nail your colors to a particular ethical approach.
Yeah.
So that might help a little bit, Francis.
No, definitely, because I've always found it quite interesting that I remember working with an organisation some time ago, and there was a kind of groundswell of opinion about taking funding and whether that would be a reputational risk. But they had a quite well-formed policy around it, and they had quite clearly stipulated the areas from which they would not take funding because of the beneficiary audience they were talking about. So if you don't like, and I'm just throwing this out, it wasn't this organization, but for example, if you don't like Nestle, but that's not part of your policy, can you refuse a donation from an organization that's not? And so those things have to be thought through very carefully, and they should be part of your policy. Sabrina, I see you nodding vigorously. What's your views in terms of reputation versus other risk management areas?
I was nodding vigorously, Francis, because you mentioned Nestle, and I literally went through that with an organization I worked with. They were being offered, the organization was being offered a very localized and regionalized grant from Nestle to work on a particular kind of water sanitation and hygiene program. But the organization was saying, but wait a minute, we don't like what they did with the baby formula. We don't like what they're doing with water rights, and we've said no, in other regions. And are we okay saying no here, or do we have to say yes? And they had to work their way through that. They ultimately said no. And again, I said, good for them. Again, those types of decisions, and your question is great, Francis, is the reputation versus the going concern. Those are real concerns, real risks that organizations are facing because of just, again, the funding situation and their ability to survive. So, the question is, what's the balance? I guess it's how long is a piece of string? I think that one of the things, I really like your point, Francis, about the beneficiaries. I think that this is part of the whole decolonization of aid, decolonization of charities, is really bringing that local voice in and talking to the beneficiaries. And, I love the idea of having a beneficiary on the board, or having trustees who have lived experience of the type of work that your organization is doing. It brings such a richness to the conversation. It brings such a different dimension. And those kind of, tricky questions that you're raising about, do we accept this funding or not? Somebody who's representing the beneficiaries, or someone with that lived experience, may have a very different perspective than those of us who have not been through that. They could say absolutely not. These are the perpetrators. This is why my community, my under-recognized community, is in the situation that they're in. We're absolutely not going to accept that. Or it might be, we don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face, and we're willing to accept it, but with particular caveats. And that individual or that group of beneficiaries or participants may be in the best position to advise the board. So maybe one of the things that we get out of today is making sure that the board has a group of trusted advisors that are from the community that you're serving.
Really great point. So that leads me on to thinking, I'm going to direct this one at you, Karen. Given the responsibilities that trustees hold, isn't it just a natural instinct that they're going to be a bit risk averse?
So I think that this has always been the kind of charge that a lot of people put at boards. And again, I think we've got to move away from saying trustees as a group, because trustees are individuals. They're all going to have their own risk tolerance. They're all going to have their own risk experience. They're all going to be affected by the different experiences that they have, whether that's in the workplace or within this honorary role. But it's undoubtedly the case that it is the trustees who have their neck on the block when everything goes a little bit pear-shaped. So of course they are going to have that need to be super sure that they're not doing something that transgresses the law or breaches guidance or is going to otherwise get them into difficulty, as well as wanting to drive forward the best impact for the beneficiaries that they're serving. So, you know, sometimes we tend to think of trustees as being to this or to that, but actually they're dipping in and out of a situation. They're not like the executive where they're seeing and living this every single day. So they are coming, and that brings both advantages and disadvantages. And the example that I would give is, if you have a close family friend that is, you know, you come and see, who's a junior, you will notice, if you are only somebody who's visiting periodically, massive shifts in that person's the way they show up, the way they speak, the way they grow, whereas their parents will see that there's incremental changes, but they won't necessarily see those big jumps. And that can be both a brilliant thing because it gives you a fresh perspective on that change, or it can be something that triggers prejudices, worries, fears, that you then have to, as the parent, explain to that person that there is, you know, there's less issue going on there. So I think it is lazy when we say trustees are risk averse. It's certainly true that some trustees are, but my bold might be your reckless. So we need to navigate the language, and we need to understand what it is that trustees are feeling about a situation, and pick out their own individual risk tolerance towards a particular issue that they're facing collectively.
Frances, can I ask a quick question though, just to play devil's avocado on this particular point? I mean, yes, you know, trustees, our necks are on the chopping block, so to speak. But I guess my question is are trustees afraid of the boogeyman of oversight and responsibility more than they should be? Right? We all know, and I mean, are we being more conservative because of the specter of accountability? And I guess my question is, have we seen any stories in the news recently of trustees being held accountable for any of the bad behavior of charities? Right? Does that accountability actually exist? Whether or not it should is a different question, but are we holding ourselves back? Not, of course, in irresponsible decisions, but are we holding ourselves back in decisions where we might be able to push a little bit because of the perception of this strict conservative accountability? I guess that's my question for everybody, because I know where I stand on it.
Very good question. I will give the only example that I can think about, and I think that's also about how you balance risk. And I'm going back to the Oxfam case a few years ago, where obviously they were managing a very tricky situation, but did they get the balance right in terms of the beneficiary and the reputation of the organization? But those kinds of situations are quite rare. But there's lots of guidance around that now. So obviously NCBO have ethical principles, which is beneficiary first, et cetera, and that kind of guidance is really helpful to direct trustees in terms of prioritization. Let's put it that way. Karen, anything you want to add to that one?
I was going to say, I think the answer to that is that yes, some trustees do overly worry on something. But there are examples. So if you think about Comic Relief a few years back being doorstep for getting, you know, having investments in arms and various other things, that did have an impact on the trustees. They were on the front pages of the news for quite some months. Kids Company, whilst there might not be a legal output that says actually you're going to be culpable in this circumstance, they were taken all the way through on the insolvency side of things for wrongful trading. So, and there are examples where charities that have been perhaps unincorporated have perhaps had I'm thinking of the Wedgwood case where the pension liability then resulted in them having to, the trustees having personal exposure. So I think there are few and far between situations where you actually, when push comes to shove, are held to, quotes, account for it. But I think some of the softer reputational pieces, you know, speaking to people like the trustees that were on Beat Bullying, if you remember that years ago when that went down, many of those continue to carry some of the reputational damage as a result of being in the news. So it's not necessarily the fact that you are going to be in the firing line, it's the risk and the exposure and the damage and the legacy that leaves that can cause individuals to hold back in a particular situation.
So do we think there's, sorry, go on, Alex.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I would just, to add to that, as you say, that those sort of issues have been generally in the biggest, the sort of the higher profile charities. I mean, what I tend to see in some of the smaller charities is that, or medium-sized charities, is that perhaps those they might not be being held to account by exterior, well, it might be their peers or people they know, or just the feeling that they're going to get it wrong, which is potentially going to hold them back. You don't want to be the person who bet the house on black. It's that sort of thing. Is how I see it. And actually, the longer the term that the trust, I mean, I'm talking about investment side of things here, but the longer the term of the trustees, the more happy they are to take risk, it seems, the more that they're happy to say, okay, we're looking at, we're looking at 5 years, or we're looking at 10 years. I mean, this is for lucky charities who can do that. But if you've got that long-term tenure, I think then you can have a long-term mindset. Whereas if you're just in position for a matter of years, then you might not want to risk anything, because you don't want to see over your period of tenure any deterioration in the sort of value of that charity. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So following on from that, and a few people have already thrown this word out, which is risk tolerance. And for the benefit of those people who might not be familiar with risk tolerance, how can that help? How can that help a charity in terms of understanding and setting their risk tolerance levels and knowing what they are?
Yes. So, were you going to say something, Karen? No. Okay, good. So, yeah, risk tolerance is definitely my sort of language, and there are various things that you can look at when it comes to risk. One is your sort of attitude to risk, right? Which is a more personal thing, but you need to, when you're thinking about your attitude to risk, you need to have your trustee's hat on, not your personal hat on. You need to think about the organization, not yourself. And there are tools that trustees and boards can use. So there are risk questionnaires, which can be a really helpful guide. Now, of course, if you've got a big board of trustees, you're going to have people with different views. That doesn't stop it being a useful exercise. You can look at what the average approach is, or the average mindset is, and it can be a really good discussion piece. So there's definitely an aspect around attitude to risk. The other key thing when it comes to in investments, so I think this is across the board, is your capacity for loss. Loss is not something that we want to talk about, but it's a reality of taking risk, certainly in the short term. And when it comes to sort of analyzing capacity for loss, then things to look at are, what is your investment time horizon? If you're going to need money in a year's time, then you can't afford to take much risk. If you need money in 10 years' time, then you can ride out the ups and you can ride out the downs in markets. Also, things to look at, what are your other sources of income? If one dries up, what are what other sources have you got available? Similarly, what are your other assets and liabilities, and how do they affect your capacity for loss? So yeah, in my world, it's very much about looking at attitude to risk on one side, capacity for loss, and bringing those two sort of together into sort of fusing those two.
Thanks, Alex. That's really helpful. Does anybody else want to jump in on the risk tolerance? How do charities set and establish their own risk tolerance levels?
I've got a few thoughts. So I think one of the things that people make, I think I see as a common mistake, is that people think that you can set it and that does something to the actual risk. It doesn't. All it is providing you with the tools to navigate risk when you approach it. And so therefore codifying it, putting it down in terms that everyone agrees. And sometimes you'll see people using sliding scales. So they might say we're highly tolerant of risk here, or we're completely cautious there. And it doesn't matter which words you use. What matters is that the words are shared language and people understand what you mean when you say, I've got a high tolerance for this. The second thing is that I think it's really important for organisations, probably more important than the sort of generic risk appetite, to understand what their red lines are. So for CFG, for example, we stand for great financial management. So not getting our finances right is a red line for us, and that therefore elevates it in terms of how much we're prepared to tolerate and what we're not prepared to tolerate. In a childcare setting, as I mentioned before, safeguarding of children, it's going to be a red line. You've got to get it right. And there'll be others for different areas. And then the last thing that I would say is thinking about how you navigate your outliers. So if these are all different individuals that we're asking to kind of say what their tolerance for risk is, you will have outliers on either side. Now, they may be your voices of wisdom that you don't want to be discounting, or they might be people that derail an entire project because they're like, you know, a little Rottweiler with a bone, and they won't let you move on. So for me, it's that thinking about what is the language and how are you going to navigate this? How are you going to use it as a practical tool to navigate these conversations?
Absolutely. And one thing that I advise people from a governance perspective is think about the types of risks that you might encounter before that risk materializes, because that helps you particularly in setting your tolerance levels, because you're not coming from a place of fear, emotion, all of that stuff. You've done it quite objectively rather than subjectively.
Frances, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, because absolutely.
I want to throw a little bit of a spanner in the works here, because I actually think that taking the approach of what is your risk tolerance or what is your risk appetite, frankly, is about as useless as risk matrices and risk registers. So the type of risk management that I practice is objective-centered risk management, right? And so instead of having a long list of horrible things that might or may not happen, right? Instead of having a risk, appetite statement that's based on a fabricated situation that no one's ever going to look at again. When I work with trustees, one of the things I always say to them is, when was the last time before you made a decision and voted on something, you said, wait a minute, we need to go check our risk appetite statement, or wait a minute, we need to go check our risk register and see what number is this, what color is this on our risk matrix. Organizations do these things because they can tick a box and say we're managing risk, but Karen is right on. You can have the most beautifully crafted risk appetite statement. It is not going to do anything. The same way that using a risk matrix doesn't manage risk, and the same way that having a risk register does not manage risk. And send me the hate mail, that's fine, I'm used to it. But it doesn't, it's a false sense of security for organizations. And it breaks my heart when I see charities and nonprofits using these tools. If you start with your objective, and Frances, you said it, it's objective, not subjective, right? If you actually start with your objectives, right, your organization has a strategy. And within that strategy, they want to achieve certain things over a 3-year time frame or a 5-year time frame. Those are your strategic objectives. If you start there with your analysis, and I'm happy for anybody on the call, reach out to me. I'm happy to do a free 1-hour review on how objective-centered risk management works. If you put your objective in the middle, everybody has agreed on that objective. The trustees, the management, the staff, this is what we want to achieve. You start your analysis there. You work your way out around what are our threats and what are our opportunities around that objective. What are the triggers of those threats and opportunities? And finally, what are our preparation elements? Once we have a better sense of the landscape, and particularly those preparation elements, they're either active monitoring or mitigation. and we actually price out how much those active monitoring or mitigation things cost, it then gives trustees and senior management data to make a forward-looking decision based centrally on what the organization wants to achieve. If you're using a risk matrix or risk appetite statement, it's very fluffy, right? We don't know, okay, well, we got this risk register that has 28 things on it, and we're going to monitor them, but do we have the resources we need to do that? Are we buying the right insurance? Can we afford the right insurance? Do we have the right training for our staff? Can we monitor safeguarding issues? How are we monitoring fraud? It's on our risk register, but that risk register is separated from the business of the organization. It is disconnected from the ways of working. So if you start with your objectives and you do your analysis that way, it beautifully dovetails with your business planning, it dovetails with your project management, and it integrates risk management. So it becomes something that's built in and not bolted on. So burn your risk registers. Final word.
Here. Risk is life. And risk registers push you down, minimizing harm, not maximizing impact and opportunity. So I'm completely with you. Thank you for saying that.
So I want to explore that further. I don't think there is a board that I've ever worked with who would have been happy for me to say we're ripping up the risk register. It's all, they just want it captured. Oh, well, they would just want it captured and listed, but I take the point that you make, and for me, oftentimes the tool isn't the thing, it's the process and the conversation that goes behind it. However, it would be useful for the people who are here to think about, you know, what are the kind of practical frameworks, approaches that people can use to manage risk in their organizations. Karen.
So I can say from personal experience, in 2013-14, we had a terrible year at CFG that nearly took the organisation out. And as a consequence, I spoke to my board about ripping up our risk register, and we did. Now, we haven't got no risk register, but we have separated it. So we have a risk control assurance table that is the brainstorming. What are the things that we're trying to achieve? What are the things that we need to control? What are those controls? How expensive are they? Are we going to just accept it? All of the sorts of things you'd expect. And that doesn't get looked at every single week, every single month. That gets looked at twice a year, or if something's tested. So if we have a cyber attack, for example, we look at our control. Do we need to update it? Do we need to, because the documentation of it is the bit that protects the trustees and enables them to demonstrate the things that they've done to try and safeguard the charity against loss. So you have to really have something. The other bit of it that we have is something we call a risk issues log. And we don't try and limit the number of things on it. These are just the risks that we're currently dealing with. And that is a regular conversation. I won't go into great detail about it right now because it's not the framework, but the framework on which this is based is something that Robert Kaplan and Annette Mikes put together. I think it dates back to 2012, but it was published in the Harvard Business Review. And what they do is they categorize risk in 3 ways. They say, what are the things that are external to us? They're beyond our control. There is literally nothing we can do to stop that thing happening, but we may need to be able to prepare to recover after the thing happens. So business continuity, disaster recovery, things like that. Then you've got a bunch of things that are preventable. And they are the things that you've got controls in place, insurance in place, various other things. And once you've got that in, other than testing them periodically, you can probably leave that alone. You talk about those things by exception. And that then frees you up to look at the 3rd category, which is strategic risk. And these are the active choices that you make. And this is where you do move from that, here's a policy, and it sits there. This is where you start the conversation with, what are the risks? What are the opportunities? What are the various appetites for risk around the table? What is our ability to put controls in place here? What can we live with? What can't we live with? So it's all about discussion and decision making. And it's a brilliant framework that, I mean, we're currently trying to put it into a charity context as a tool for the sector. It's not quite there yet, but I think you could do worse than starting with looking at that and just thinking about how you categorize your own current risks and make those tools a much more accessible thing so that you're having conversations that lead you further forward rather than update a document.
That's great. Thank you. Anybody want to add to that?
I just want to say that objective-centered risk management also is something that's been around for at least a decade, if not more, and it is ISO 31000 compliant. And it sounds very similar. Karen, I'd love to chat with you later and learn more about what you're doing, because it does sound very similar around framing those conversations. Because at the end of the day, risk management is conversations. One of the things that just makes me sad, and I had a conversation with somebody a couple of days ago, this individual is risk and compliance person in the UN. And they kind of have resigned themselves to being like, yep, I update the risk register and I bridge conversations between people who are raising things and, decision makers. And I asked her and I said, well, but what do you do? And she goes, well, that's what I do. And I feel like that's kind of like a risk person who's sort of given up and kind of, because I do think that risk managers and that risk awareness and that risk mindset needs to be active. It needs to be dynamic. It can't be passive. It can't be, we're going to update the risk register once a quarter. And that's it, because that's looking backwards. And Clarice DeCruz, who's fantastic. She's very active in getting on board. I had her on my podcast. She said one of the most amazing things about trustees managing risk. She was saying, trustees navigate, senior management drives the car, right? But trustees can't navigate if they're looking in the rearview mirror. And these traditional risk tools are giving trustees data from 3 months ago, or even a month ago. That's not what trustees need. Boards and trustees need live data to be able to address dynamic questions. And so what Karen's talking about and what I'm talking about, I think are ways that charities can start to manage risk. And again, though, it's really funny, you're going to have to convince your trustees to let go of the risk register, just like you said, Francis. And there's ways that we can do this. We can take baby steps. We can do things in parallel so they can actually see the value in some of these new ways of doing risk. But the private sector is seeing this, right? More and more private sector organizations are leaving those risk matrices behind because they know that there's no value in them. There's a fantastic writer, his name's Doug Hubbard. He's a risk expert, and he wrote a book that's called How to Measure Anything. And basically in that book, he says risk matrices and risk registers are about as good as horoscopes, right? That's about as much faith that you can put in them. And so I think if we're talking about trustees writ large, sorry, Karen, who have a conservative mindset, if maybe they saw those tools that way, they'd be willing to kind of move to something else. So I think it might be a security blanket and a false sense of security, the way that we're doing risk right now.
So follow on to that is there a different approach to risk management that small and large charities should take? Is it the same? How do people approach it based on the size of their organization? Shall I pick, or is one of you going to jump in? Alex?
I can talk about that within my sort of area, and generally the size of the organization tends to be a red herring when it comes to the approach to your investments. What matters is what are you trying to achieve and what level of risk are you prepared to accept, rather than what size you are. I mean, the only caveat I would say to that is that if you're investing smaller amounts, then there's a question mark over how costly it is to access those investments, or how much time or effort might be required in order to manage those investments. But generally, when I'm talking to clients, it's not about the size, it's about your objectives and the level of risk which is appropriate for you.
It makes sense. And that then I think the good question to follow up with is just to think about what are the common types of risks that are facing charities today that they need to consider. Yeah. Can I go to you first, Karen?
Yeah, of course. So I think the obvious one, we've touched on it already, is around funding and finance. We are living in incredibly tight times for many organisations, and we're also facing into quite big changes demographically. So whereas we potentially had baby boomers that would leave you a legacy, in 10, 20 years time, the committed giving of the next generation it's not going to be in the same way. And actually the size of donations into the sector has remained largely static. If you look at the NCVA Almanac, what you've seen is movement between the the different funding pots within the sector, not more money coming into the sector. So I think there's a big issue around that for all organisations. Digital and AI, these are huge issues that are both an opportunity and a risk. And I fear that people will tend to respond to them as a risk rather than as an opportunity, and therefore kind of the risk to the organisation is that they miss the boat on something that is happening, whether you want it to or not. You can't hold back the tide on it. I think complexity is a massive issue for organisations now. It feels like things are changing rapidly. It's very volatile, it's very uncertain, we're living in a high inflationary environment at the moment, but everything could change quite quickly, politically, environmentally, socially, all of those things. And of course, the environment is the last one that I think people are going to need. There's going to be a demand from all stakeholders to be thinking much more about the planet and how we sit within that climate crisis.
Can I jump in on this one too, Frances?
Yes, please do.
Karen, those were all excellent ones. And I'm going to add to your list staff and safeguarding, but when it comes to staff and particularly burnout and high rates of, abuse and retaliation. These things happen in our sector. And, I have a very good friend who just finished her PhD, and she wrote her PhD on the halo effect around charities and what that meant about their decision making. And so part of it was, about accepting funding, but the other half of her paper was about how they treat their staff. And, you have this sense where charity workers lead with their heart. We certainly don't lead with our wallets, and we certainly don't lead with our heads sometimes. We lead with our hearts. We want to leave the world a better place. We truly believe that. We are true believers. And because of that, we're willing to kind of put up with some stuff that maybe we shouldn't sometimes. And we're seeing more and more people, and I think it's a good thing, embracing speak up and speak out. You're seeing a lot more people speaking out in large INGOs, the UN, about mistreatment and harassment, sexual harassment, retaliation, threats, things like that. You're seeing more whistleblowers, and bless the whistleblowers. It is so courageous. It takes so much courage. They are so brave to come out and do these things, because we know that in these environments, there's massive power imbalances. So whether it's a small charity that maybe was started by 4 or 5 people and that group is still there, right? They hold a particular type of power, or it's one of these large charities or, INGOs that you read about. I think that for trustees, it's vitally important that you keep your finger on the pulse of the staff. And I had another on my podcast, someone was talking about, the information that gets to trustees, what he said, it was sanctified, right? And so one of the questions I always ask guests on my podcast, particularly about trustees, is how can trustees get the unvarnished information, right? How can they get the information with the sharp corners? And people have lots of different ideas on how to do that. But if you are a trustee and you want to know the health of your organization at its core, find a way to get that. And it might not even be the pulse survey that your staff takes, because people are afraid to speak up. Find a way to try and get that information. Make sure that you have a healthy environment. Make sure you have a speak up, speak out environment. You may have 16 different ways, for staff to report things, but if you've only received 2 reports in 1 year, you have a problem. You have a barrier to reporting. So I would add that to the long list of risks that Karen already added, is the health of your own organization, the health of your staff, because your charity is not going to be successful unless your staff is healthy.
That's a really good point. I was having this conversation with somebody earlier today in an organization that I worked with. They were having problems, and the indicator the trustees use as their proxy for the health of the organization was how many tribunals and grievances do we have. There were too many, and they wanted to see a reduction. So a pulse survey wouldn't necessarily say how many people are taking us to tribunal or how many people are issuing grievances. So you have to think what's right for your organization in that particular moment. So I've got a question here from the chat, and the panel have been asked if they could recommend or signpost risk questionnaires that would work for smaller charities who wanted to start a discussion with members of the board on attitudes to risk. And that's general risk, not just investment risk, but the whole shebang.
Alex, do you have something?
Well, no, sadly. I mean, I don't know if there is sort of, and again, this would be with an investment hat on. I don't know if there is anything out there that's freely available that you can use to judge your investment risk, sadly.
So I have something that's really interesting. So I attended a risk conference in Zurich a couple weeks ago. And I don't have it off the top of my head, but I promise everybody on this call, and Francis, I'll get you the name of it. There is a software that some academics developed that you can take it's like a 15-minute test. Anybody can take it, it's free. And it will give you your own personal risk profile. It's really interesting software. I saw them demoing it at the conference. And you know, what you can kind of do is then compare everybody, you know, on your board, maybe if they all kind of log in and they take this and see where they all come out on it. And then of course it's a consultancy firm, and you know, you engage with them. I did ask them if they had charity prices. They said yes. So you can all tell them that I said that they have charity pricing. But I promise I'll share this. But it was really interesting because what comes out is like a spider diagram on like, you know, 6 or 8 different types of risk. And then you can map that against, and they were showing how they have everybody in an organization take this. And then you map all the different departments. And what was so fascinating, of course, is you've got the salespeople way out here on risk, and you have the finance people way in here in risk, and then you have to get them to work together. But in a charity, you know, and on a board, like Karen was talking about in the beginning, you have people who, with their own personal hats on, sit in different risk places. So let me see if I can find that. If I'll put it in the link if I can find it. Otherwise, I'll definitely reach out to the organizers, because it could be fun for a board to do, right? A board away day, everybody takes the test and brings in their results.
Yeah, that would be great. Karen, what would you suggest in terms of an organisation, a small charity that wants to start that conversation about risk management for their organisation?
Yeah, so I'm going to do a shameless plug. I've just finished writing a book for Directory of Social Change on finance generally, but there's a chapter in there about risk, and I break down completely to the real bare bones what it is you're trying to achieve, and I think there's some easy to access thoughts and stories and anecdotes within that will help provoke a conversation and a reaction. So I'm going to say it's available for pre-ordering, and I would like you to have a dip into that. But there are some other things that you can do very low tech. So, you know, I've done lots of sessions with boards where we have chosen opposites. So good enough, leading edge, make money, serve beneficiaries. And if you do it on a scale of 1 to 10, and you ask the individual board members to write down their numbers separately from each other and then put them up, not only does it give you a very good visual of the spread of different people's opinions, but it also enables you to, if you take the numbers, give yourself sort of a mean score, a modal score, etc. And it's just quite useful information. What I would say is don't pin too much on any of these frameworks. They are a means to an end, and the end is discussion and decision. You know, these are useful tools to provoke conversations, not to give you it's not a science, it's an art.
Yes, I think that's the thing that you impart, which is why I say the conversation is the most important part. The tool that you might use to get there is in some ways, you know, you just what works for you. It's not necessarily irrelevant because it helps, but it's a conversation. It's a bit like when you're developing strategy. Actually, how many people refer to the strategy? What they remember is the conversation and the process that they went through to get there. So we are unbelievably on our last 7 minutes. So I'm going to ask you each to talk about briefly what would be your 2 to 3 key takeaways that trustees can implement right away to improve their approach to risk management. Who'd like to kick off?
I'm very happy to say a few words, Francis.
Yeah.
So again, from the perspective of investments, I think the key thing is to have a robust investment policy statement where you've had the sort of conversations that that we've just been talking about, understanding tolerance to risk, time horizons, capacity for loss, all of these factors, but having a proper discussion about also what you want to achieve and getting the right overall sort of fusion of that. So an investment policy statement which you regularly review and I would say challenge. The other thing is that if you've got a discretionary investment manager, then you should keep in contact with them regularly. So you need to be informing them about what's going on in your organization, what change is happening, and whether that might have some impact on the investments that they are managing for you. And anything else? Oh, the last thing is and I know this isn't terribly easy, but the greater clarity that you can have over your cash needs in the future, the more confident you can be that the investment portfolio is structured appropriately for you, because time horizon is a key part of investing, and I know this is difficult, but the greater clarity you can have over what your cash needs might be into the future, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, the more you can be confident that your investments are appropriate or suitable for you. So there are a few ideas there, Frances.
Thank you very much, Alex. Moving over to you, Karen.
So there's so many things, particularly that Alex and Sabrina have said, that I think will be incredibly useful for people to take away. But I think I would sum up mine as saying risk is life. You're not going to have a risk-free environment. It's like a balloon. If you push it in somewhere, it's going to pop out somewhere else. So if you take one thing away from it, from this session, from what I've said, take away that piece. Risk is life. This is not about the documents you fill, the systems you buy, the processes that you put in place. This is about the discussions and the conversations that you have. And if I can sort of add in that, it's culture that is going to be the determinant as to whether you satisfactorily navigate risks that you encounter.
Thank you. That's great. Sabrina.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo everything that the panel said today. This has been so much fun to talk about this. I think what I would say for trustees is risk is a double-sided coin, right? Risk has threats, but it also has opportunities. And if you, as a trustee who is, charged with the sacred duty of ensuring that that organization is serving its beneficiaries, you want to make sure that you're scanning the horizon for opportunities just as much as threats. And when we talk about risk, everyone goes negative. And I always try and say, okay, it's easier to go negative. We can think of a million horrible things that might happen. But let's think about what are the opportunities that we want to be prepared for that can accelerate our impact, that can double, triple, quadruple our impact. And that actually makes risk more fun, and it makes it more interesting, and it actually makes it more applicable. So the first thing I would say is trustees, don't, if you're going down that worry hole, stop yourself and try and come back out to the light and flip it and say, well, what are the things that could go right? And how could we serve our beneficiaries and our participants even better? The second thing I would say is, don't be afraid of risk. And if, your board, know your limitations, and I'll put in a shameless plug myself, bring in people from the outside who can help you. There's lots of people who talk about risk in charities. I'm one of them, but there's lots of great people out there that do that. Bring in somebody to help you. Or, if you feel like you need a little bit more regular support for your organization, but you don't have the funds to hire somebody full-time, you can hire a part-time person, right? I do that. I do part-time, basically people, smaller organizations share me. And, you have a part-time financial controller, you have a part-time, accountant. You can have a part-time risk advisor, somebody who's helping you navigate those reputational, legal, and financial challenges that your organization might face. Whether it's on a regular monthly basis, you get 10 hours of time, or whether it's as needed. Bring in that expert help. Don't try and do it yourself. If it's something that you're having a hard time managing, you don't need to manage it all yourself. And the last thing that I do want to definitely put in a plug for is the podcast Tolerable Risk. At the end of every episode, there is a section specifically for trustees. Every single guest that I've had on this podcast, I specifically say, what is your advice for trustees? So, I encourage you, I've got guests who have been talking about intellectual property, HR, physical security, grant management, programmatic design, monitoring and evaluation. I've got these amazing experts, and all of them have some really wonderful advice specifically for trustees. So if you're interested, definitely check out the podcast.
Thank you very much. Right, so we're on time. For those people who want to click on the link that Sabrina shared, do that now before the chat closes imminently. But I would just want to thank the panel. There's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much. I hope it's been useful to all of you who've attended today, and thank you all for your time. Take care.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much,
Frances.
everybody. Thank you, Frances, for chairing such an excellent session. Thank you to all three of our panel. Thank you so much to Rathbones, our sponsor, for enabling us to make this and other sessions in our Trustee Learning Programme free to attend. If you wouldn't mind filling out our evaluation form, we'd love to know how you found this session. If you are able to make a donation, please do so. The link is in the chat. It helps us to keep this programme free. I have also included in the chat a link to upcoming free Trustee Learning Programme sessions, and you can also download our free guides and resources from the session. On our website, you'll also be able to book your weekly pass to the Festival of Trusteeship, which is taking place from the 4th to the 8th of November. The early bird tickets are £15. Do visit our website to read about the more intensive and bespoke support that we can provide. And if you sign up to our newsletter, you can keep up to date with topical issues facing trustees and how we can support you. So with that, thank you everyone for your time. And I will be closing the chat right now. Thank you.